The Detroit winter of 1934, a box of inexpensive macaroni, costing about 9 to 10 cents, sat on a wooden table worn pale from years of wiping and scrubbing. The white enamel pot, with a small chip along its rim, had been placed on the wood-burning stove before it was fully dark outside. Steam began to fog the window pane, while the kitchen carried the smell of burning wood, bacon grease stored in an old coffee can, and the aged paper scent of the tin box holding the recipe cards. One card still bore a dried tomato stain on the corner, and the pencil writing, now faded to brown, simply read, "Macaroni, beans, bacon grease, 1935. No one had written them to be printed in a book. They had only been kept because every dinner had once helped a family make it through one more day. The box of macaroni on the table, and the whole family, still had to make it through the evening. The mother opened the box of macaroni very early. The corner of the cardboard box had softened after being picked up and set down so many times, making a faint dry sound when it touched the tabletop. The wooden spoon stirred circles through the water that had not yet come to a boil, steady and slow, as though it were calculating more than cooking. Half a bottle of ketchup, costing about 15 cents, sat close to the stove to be used sparingly over many weeks. A few pieces of stale bread rested on a white enamel plate. The black pepper jar held only a light dusting at the bottom. The children sat around the small table, quietly watching the steam rise. The mother kept stirring the pot, then added 1 spoonful of bacon grease that had been saved from the previous meal. When the grease met the hot surface of the pot, it gave off a soft sizzle, just enough to fill the kitchen with the aroma of what seemed like a large piece of meat being placed on the stove. If kitchens, like these, still bring back something in your memory, stay with this story from the very beginning. The tin box still held many unopened cards. Every old piece of paper preserved a dinner that had once fed an entire family when the money in their pockets was nearly gone, and every dish would be told exactly as it had once appeared on the table. Tonight, there is still a pasta dish costing less than 4 cents per serving, a dish so unusual that many people today would think it was only a story, a pot of Hoover stew that once appeared around shantytowns during the years of the Great Depression, and the final dish cost only about 25 cents, but was enough to last through 2 dinners for 6 people. In those years, pasta was never just pasta. It stretched 1 more can of tomatoes, carried the aroma of 1 spoonful of bacon grease throughout the kitchen, turned half a pot of leftover beans into a new meal, and kept the light above the table shining for 1 more evening. The tin box was opened once again. Inside were no elaborate recipes. There were only dinners remembered by the smell of tomatoes, steam, and the hands that had never let the pot grow cold before mealtime. 30 pasta dinners begin with dish number 30, plain pasta, butter, bacon, graze. When poverty was made a little easier to swallow before the pots of red tomato sauce appeared on the stove, many dinners in working-class neighborhoods of Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago during 1934 began with a pot of steaming boiled pasta. 1 card in the tin box bore only a few brief words. Butter first. The pencil writing had faded over the years, while the paper still carried a streak of flour along the edge, like the handprint of the person who had once held it before dinner. Dish number 30 is buttered noodles. 1 pound of inexpensive egg noodles, costing about 9 to 10 cents, was boiled until just tender, then quickly transferred to a large bowl. A small piece of butter, or margarine if the household had any, is placed on top of the hot noodles, so it would slowly melt into thin golden streaks. The mother mixed everything with a wooden spoon whose handle had been worn smooth, but sprinkled on a little black pepper if the spice jar still held a few remaining specks, then divided the pot of noodles into 4 or 5 portions. Some households saved a little of the cooking water to keep the noodles soft longer. In the cramped rented apartments of those years, a dinner costing less than 20 cents was enough to keep warmth lingering around the table a little while longer. Some meals needed nothing more than the steam still rising from the bowl. Dish number 29 is spaghetti with bacon grease sauce. The can of grease beside the stove was opened, revealing a layer of solid white grease with a few brown flecks left over from the previous breakfast. One small spoonful was scooped into a cast iron skillet and allowed to melt slowly until its familiar smoky aroma spread throughout the room. The hot spaghetti was added and quickly tossed until every strand glistened beneath the yellow light. If there were still a few charred pieces of bacon, they too were scraped from the bottom of the can and sprinkled on top with a little black pepper. The entire pot of spaghetti usually cost only about 12 to 15 cents if the grease had already been saved beforehand. Poverty still sat around that table, but the smell of hot grease gave dinner the memory of a more substantial breakfast. Dish number 28 is buttered noodles with breadcrumbs. A slice of old bread was crumbled by hand and toasted in butter or bacon grease until it turned golden brown and gave off a gentle crackling sound. The crumbs were sprinkled over the freshly mixed noodles, creating a light crispness on the tongue. Between 1935 and 1937, a loaf of bread costing about 7 to 9 cents was still used down to the very last piece. The crumbs were sprinkled over soup, pasta, and many other dinners so that not a single portion would be left behind on the cutting board. Plain pasta with a little grease carried the whole family through another evening. Then, when the kitchen cupboard still held a can of tomatoes, half a bottle of ketchup, or a can of red soup, the first color would return to the pot that was boiling. Bread of tomatoes, when a bowl of pasta looked more like a proper dinner. In 1935, a bottle of ketchup costing about 15 cents still sat in the back corner of the kitchen cupboard. The light rarely reached. The glass bottle bore dried red streaks around its mouth, a sign of many dinners that had already passed. Inside the tin box, one recipe card written in pencil read, "Tomatoes make it look like supper." That brief line rested beside a water stain that had turned brown with time. Dish number 27 is macaroni with ketchup. Mother squeezed a thick stream of ketchup onto the hot macaroni, then mixed it with a little pasta cooking water so the red color would soften and coat every piece evenly. If the jar still held a few black peppercorns, they were sprinkled on last. Some households added 1 spoonful of bacon grease to mellow the sweet and tangy flavor. A meal like this usually cost only about 10 to 12 cents when made with inexpensive macaroni. The children called it red pasta, while the adults quietly passed the glass bottle around to scrape out every last drop. Sometimes a poor dinner needed only a little color to make the whole table look different. Dish number 26 is spaghetti with stewed tomatoes. An old can opener popped the lid off the tomato can with a dry metallic sound, leaving a thin layer of red liquid around the rim of the tin. Around 1936, a can of stewed tomatoes, costing about 10 to 12 cents, combined with 1 pound of pasta, costing about 9 to 10 cents, was enough to make dinner for 5 or 6 people. The tomatoes were poured into a pot and cooked with a little salt, pepper, and onion if any remained in the basket. The pasta was added last, so it could absorb the flavor. Slices of old bread were always saved to soak up the tomato broth left at the bottom of the bowl. The steam carried a gentle tang that made the kitchen feel less cold as night fell. Dish number 25 is Southern macaroni and tomatoes. In many kitchens from Alabama to Georgia around 1936, macaroni was poured directly into a pot of simmering tomatoes along with a little bacon grease. Mother stirred slowly so the red liquid would soak into every tube of pasta, then added just a little sugar if the tomatoes were too sharp. The entire pot usually cost about 20 cents and was served with cornbread or a little seasonal greens. No one cared where the dish had come from. What mattered more was whether the leftovers would be enough for lunch the next day. Dish number 24 is tomato macaroni soup. 1 can of tomato soup, costing about 10 cents, was diluted with water and a handful of broken pasta was added. The soup was stirred slowly so the pasta would swell and the broth would thicken slightly. If there was any milk left, the mother added a little at the very end. Each serving cost less than 4 cents, but the warmth rising from the small bowls drew the children closer to the table. Then, in the Eastern European immigrant neighborhoods of Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Chicago, the wooden spoon began carrying a different aroma, the smell of slowly cooked cabbage and sour cream clinging to the sides of the bowl. The Eastern European kitchen, pasta with milk, sour cream, cabbage, and yellowed recap carts, Pittsburgh, winter of 1937. On a tablecloth with worn embroidered edges lay a yellowed recipe card with a few lines of Polish writing, blurred by steam and by flour-covered fingers touching it over the years. The grandchild in the family could no longer read every word on it. But when the cabbage began to soften in the skillet and the smell of hot butter spread through the room, the child knew dinner was drawing near. In kitchens like these, pasta carried the white color of milk, the gentle tang of fresh cheese, and the aroma of slowly cooked onions rather than the red color of tomatoes. Dish number 23 is noodles with fresh cheese. 1 pound of egg noodles, costing about 10 cents, was boiled until tender and then transferred to a chipped enamel bowl. The mother dropped spoonfuls of cottage cheese or pot cheese on top, an inexpensive cheese that typically cost about 12 to 15 cents per pint in 1937. The cheese softened into small white patches, clinging to the noodles with a little butter, salt, and pepper. Some households sprinkled on a little sugar for the children. The entire meal usually cost around 25 cents, or even less if the cheese had been made in the kitchen. A tarnished silver spoon served each portion. The bowl of white noodles was still enough to keep everyone gathered around the table. Dish number 22 is noodles with sour cream sauce. Half a jar of sour cream, costing about 12 to 15 cents, is quickly stirred into the hot noodles until the sauce coated the wooden spoon. A little butter, black pepper, and fried onions left in the skillet made the aroma even richer. The entire pot usually cost only about 18 to 22 cents. The cook had to mix everything while the noodles were still hot, then serve them immediately before the cream thickened. In poor Hungarian and Slovak kitchens, even 1 small spoonful of sour cream was enough to make dinner feel carefully prepared by practiced hands. Dish number 21 is poppy seed noodles. The tiny black seeds were sprinkled over noodles that had been coated with butter or grease, then tossed with a little sugar if the kitchen cupboard still held enough. 1 small jar, costing about 15 to 18 cents, would last through many meals, so the entire pot usually cost only about 15 to 20 cents. The poppy seeds clung to every strand of noodles like ink dots on an old sheet of paper, carrying a flavor that had crossed the ocean in the suitcases of families who came to America. Dish number 20 is cabbage and noodles. Haluski, 1 large cabbage, costing about 5 to 6 cents, was thinly sliced, added to a skillet of hot grease, and then cooked slowly with onions. At first, the cabbage filled the skillet to the brim. Later, it softened, became sweeter, browned around the edges in a few places, and shrank to nearly half its original volume. The egg noodles were mixed in at the very end to absorb the remaining grease, making the entire skillet of haluski, costing about 18 to 22 cents, enough to feed many people. In the Eastern European kitchen, pasta preserved the scent of the old homeland through sour cream, poppy seeds, and cabbage. In the poor Italian neighborhoods, however, pasta was about to take on a different purpose, keeping the dinner table looking like a family meal, even when there was no longer a single piece of meat to place in the center of the table. Poor Italians and dinners that need meat. The Bronx, 1936. The smell of garlic meeting hot oil drifted through the hallway before the sound of a spoon striking the bottom of the pot echoed out. In a cramped apartment, rent, heating coal, and milk for the young children were all paid for before meat. Pasta came last, inexpensive, easy to divide, capable of stretching dinner farther than the money left in their pockets. Dish number 19 is garlic spaghetti. 1 pound of spaghetti, costing about 9 to 10 cents, was boiled until tender. A few cloves of garlic, costing only about 1 to 2 cents, were crushed and lightly sautéed in oil or grease until their edges just began to brown. The hot spaghetti was added, tossed with a little pasta cooking water to keep it from drying out, and sprinkled with black pepper or dried red pepper flakes, if the jar on the shelf still held any. The entire pot usually cost less than 15 cents for 4 people. The smell of garlic made the kitchen seem fuller than the skillet really was. Dish number 18 is spaghetti pie made from leftover pasta. Half a bowl of cold spaghetti from the night before was loosened from the bowl and mixed with 2 eggs, costing about 4 to 6 cents, along with salt and pepper. The mixture was pressed into a skillet of hot grease and fried until the bottom turned golden and crisp, then flipped over with an old enamel plate. The pie was cut into slices, and the edges usually disappeared first. Someone called it leftovers. It was tomorrow night's dinner that had begun the evening before. Dish number 17 is pasta e fagioli. White beans, costing about 7 to 9 cents per pound, were soaked overnight and slowly simmered with onions, garlic, and a little grease. When the bean broth thickened, half a pound of small pasta, costing about 5 cents, was added. The entire pot usually cost about 25 to 30 cents, enough to feed a family through more than one meal. The spoon moved more slowly through the pot because the beans and pasta had come together into a thick, hot, and filling soup. Dish number 16 is egg noodles with bacon grease, Bronx style. 2 eggs were quickly beaten into yellow streaks, then rapidly mixed with freshly drained spaghetti and 1 spoonful of saved bacon grease. The heat caused the eggs to thicken around every strand of pasta, while the cook's hand kept stirring continuously to prevent the eggs from clumping. The entire pot usually cost less than 20 cents for 4 people. No one in that kitchen needed a fancy name for the dish. Noodles with eggs was enough for everyone to understand that there would still be something hot in the middle of the table that evening. From the Bronx and Brooklyn, pasta continued its journey into Appalachia, Kentucky, and West Virginia. There, pasta began to carry the aroma of milk, flour, and lard, while white sauce covered the spaghetti, as though that had always been the way the dish was meant to be cooked. And Appalachia made spaghetti its own way, West Virginia, 1935. A spoonful of flour fell into a skillet of hot lard and immediately curled around the spoon into small ivory-colored lumps. Milk was poured in, little by little, while the mother's hand stirred steadily until the white mixture began to cling to the sides of the skillet. In the house tucked deep among the hills, the child sitting at the table had grown accustomed to seeing spaghetti beneath that white gravy. To the child, it was still spaghetti, because that was how the family's kitchen had always prepared it. Dish number 15 is spaghetti with milk gravy. Between 1934 and 1936, 1 pound of relief spaghetti or inexpensive spaghetti cost about 9 to 10 cents. The milk, flour, and lard added about 6 to 8 cents, bringing the entire pot to about 15 to 20 cents for 4 or 5 people. The flour was sprinkled into the hot lard, and the milk was poured in slowly, while the spoon constantly scraped along the bottom of the skillet. When the gravy thickened, the hot spaghetti was mixed in until every strand was coated with a thin white layer. The people of Appalachia had long poured this kind of gravy over biscuits and potatoes. When spaghetti appeared in relief boxes, they placed it beneath the sauce their kitchens already knew how to make by sight and by hand. Dish number 14 is mock chicken noodle soup. 1 bouillon cube, costing about 1 to 2 cents, was dropped into a pot of boiling water, slowly dissolving into a pale golden broth. The noodles were broken into short pieces and added along with a few slices of onion, celery, or softened carrot if any remained in the basket. The entire pot usually cost less than 15 cents. Dust from the Dust Bowl years still rested on the window frame, while the bowls of hot soup carried the aroma of a chicken that had never been in the pot. Dish number 13 is macaroni with stewed onions. Onions were sliced very thin and slowly cooked in grease until their sharpness faded and their edges turned golden brown. A 5-pound sack of onions could cost about 9 to 12 cents during the years from 1935 to 1937. The boiled macaroni was mixed into the skillet, with a little cooking water added so the onion's sweetness would cling to every piece of pasta. The smell of onions cooked long enough was enough for anyone walking through the door to know that dinner had been placed on the stove. Dish number 12 is lima beans and pasta. Dried lima beans, costing about 10 to 12 cents per pound, were soaked overnight, then simmered with onions, salt, and a small piece of salt pork if the household still had any. The pasta was added when the beans were nearly tender, absorbing the broth that had thickened. The entire pot cost about 22 to 25 cents, enough to give the deep bowls a satisfying weight. The man who left the table with that bowl inside him could put on his work shoes again the next morning, head into town to look for work, or stand through another day in the relief line. Milk, onions, and beans gave the pasta substance. When those two began to run low, the kitchen would turn to peas, eggs, sauerkraut, and bowls of pasta cooked in hot milk. No meat, but there still had to be strength for tomorrow. Cleveland, 1936. A pair of work shoes still covered with dust rested by the door. A dark coat hung over the back of a chair, and in the kitchen, a can of peas had just been opened with a worn can opener. Dinners like these were placed on the table because the people in the house still had to return to the factory, search for work, or spend more hours standing in the relief line the next morning. The pot of pasta had to provide a little substance, even though the meat had disappeared many days before. Dish number 11 is macaroni with peas. 1 can of peas, costing about 8 to 10 cents, was poured into the pot along with the slightly cloudy liquid inside. The tender cooked macaroni was mixed with the pale green peas, along with a little butter, bacon grease, or salt and pepper, depending on what remained on the shelf. Between 1936 and 1937, the entire meal for 4 people usually cost less than 25 cents. That small touch of green made the bowl seem less empty beneath the dim light. Dish number 10 is egg noodles in broth. 1 egg, costing about 2 to 3 cents, beaten and then poured in a thin stream into a pot of hot broth. The spoon stirred gently, drawing the egg into soft yellow ribbons around the cooked noodles. The broth might come from bones that had been simmered again, or from an inexpensive bouillon cube, bringing the total cost of the pot to less than 15 cents. This was often the meal for days when someone came home with aching shoulders, a dry throat, and cold hands. 1 egg divided throughout the pot still carried the shape of care. Dish number 9 is noodles with sauerkraut. As soon as the jar was opened, the sour aroma immediately cut through the layer of hot grease in the skillet. Homemade sauerkraut, made from cabbage and salt, took almost no additional money from the family's pocket. It was squeezed to remove some of its liquid, slowly sautéed with onions, and then mixed with the noodles, making the entire meal cost only about 15 to 18 cents. For German and Eastern European families, the jar in the corner of the kitchen was the vegetables they had preserved through the winter, 1 handful at a time. Dish number 8 is hot milk noodles. 1 quart of milk, costing about 10 to 12 cents, was poured into a small pot and heated until a thin skin formed on the surface. The cooked noodles were added and stirred with salt, pepper, or a little sugar for the young children. The entire pot usually cost about 12 to 15 cents. This dish appeared when someone in the household was tired, when a child had a slight fever, or when the mother's hands had worked too long during the day. A bowl that was soft and warm might not keep a stomach full until morning, but it kept people sitting around the table a little longer. These dishes still carried the familiar appearance of the family kitchen. Behind them were other, more unusual dinners, where peanut butter was stirred into spaghetti, inexpensive sausages fell into a pot of Hoover stew, Canned tuna was paired with pasta. An American goulash gathered together everything that was left. Dishes that sounded strange but aunts saved dinner, 1933. The radio crackled softly in a kitchen near the railroad tracks, while 4 children sat around the table watching the large pot on the stove. The names of the dishes about to appear may sound unusual to people who have always lived with fully stocked grocery shelves. But during the years when money ran out and food had to be stretched to the very last serving, the most important question was whether the dish was inexpensive, filling, and enough to feed many people. Dish number 7 is spaghetti with peanut butter sauce. A spoonful of thick peanut butter was dropped onto a bowl of hot spaghetti, sitting heavily among the strands before slowly softening as the mother added a little pasta cooking water and stirred everything together. Around 1934, one small jar cost about 12 to 15 cents, but each pot used only a few spoonfuls. Combined with 1 pound of spaghetti costing about 10 cents and a little bacon grease, if any was available, dinner for 4 or 5 people usually cost less than 20 cents. The light brown sauce clung thickly to the pasta, providing the fat that the kitchen could rarely afford to buy in the form of meat. Dish number 6 is Hoover stew. Nearly cooked pasta was added to the pot along with stewed tomatoes, corn, beans, and inexpensive sausage, sliced very thin. Around 1933, a pound of sausage could cost about 12 cents, pasta about 9 to 10 cents, and a can of tomatoes about 10 cents. One pot costing less than 40 cents could be divided among 6 to 8 people. In charity kitchens and Hoovervilles, the ladle passed through the thin red broth before reaching the tin bowl of each person waiting near the railroad tracks. The dish belonged to an entire era more than to any single household. Dish number 5 is tuna pasta without cream soup. One can of tuna, costing about 12 to 14 cents, was opened, and the liquid or oil inside was saved to keep the pasta from becoming dry. The tuna was flaked apart with a fork and mixed with cooked pasta, onions, and breadcrumbs. The entire meal usually cost less than 30 cents for 4 people. Before tuna casserole became familiar after the war, many kitchens stretched one small can of tuna in exactly this straightforward way. Dish number 4 is American goulash. Half a pound of ground beef was cooked with onions, then almost disappeared when tomatoes and macaroni were added. Around 1935, an entire pot usually cost about 35 to 50 cents, enough to feed 6 people and sometimes still leave a little behind. There was more pasta when there was less meat. There was more liquid when there were fewer tomatoes. The pot expanded or contracted according to the money in the family's pocket, while the cook's hand served each bowl carefully so that none of them looked too empty. Those dishes gradually disappeared from the table as supermarket shelves became more fully stocked. Many families also stopped talking about the time when 1 can of tuna, 1 handful of pasta, or a few spoonfuls of peanut butter had to be divided with such careful calculation. These pasta dinners gradually disappeared. By the early 1960s, the lights in supermarkets had grown brighter. Boxes of dinner mixes stood in neat rows on the shelves, and frozen dinners had begun to fill the freezers of many American families. The can of bacon grease that had once sat beside the stove was put away. The recipe cards written in pencil remained in the drawer, but the cook's hands opened them less and less. Some dishes that had once carried entire families through weeks of short paychecks were gradually left behind because they carried memories of the years when people had to count every penny before dinner. Dish number 3 is American chop suey. In the late 1930s, half a pound of ground beef, costing about 10 cents, was cooked with onions before canned tomatoes and macaroni were added. The sound of the pasta striking the sides of the pot echoed with a light clatter before sinking beneath the red sauce. The entire pot usually cost about 35 to 45 cents, enough for 6 people. In New England, the dish remained on dinner tables for a long time because the meat could become scarcer, the pasta could become more plentiful, and yet every bowl still carried the aroma of a meat dinner. Dish number 2 is savory macaroni pudding made from leftover pasta. The cold pasta from the previous day was placed into a baking dish. Then 1 egg, costing about 2 to 3 cents, was beaten with a little milk, salt, and pepper. The mixture was poured over the pasta, sprinkled with breadcrumbs if any remained, and baked until the top set into a light golden crust. Between 1936 and 1939, the entire dish could cost less than 10 cents if the pasta had already been available. Yesterday never truly ended at the bottom of the pot. It was cut into slices for tonight. Dish number 1 is bean and pasta soup. 1 pound of dried white beans, costing about 7 to 9 cents, was soaked overnight, then slowly simmered with onions, celery, garlic, and 1 small piece of salt pork, if the kitchen could spare another 8 to 10 cents. The bean broth turned cloudy and thick. Half a pound of pasta, costing about 5 cents, was added. The mother stirred along the bottom of the pot, served 6 bowls for the evening meal, and saved the rest to be reheated the following day. The entire pot cost only about 25 cents, yet it was enough to carry 6 people through 2 days if each portion was divided carefully. After these 30 pasta dishes, what remained in the tin box was not the story of how inexpensive pasta once was. It was the trace left behind by kitchens that knew how to stretch 1 can of tomatoes, 1 egg, half a bowl of cold pasta, and the patience of the person standing by the stove.